Throughout the ages, many legends have clawed their way from their graves. Vampires crept in the darkness, hunting for the living. But what's the truth behind the legend? Fangs. If there is one characteristic trait that makes a vampire recognizable in different movies, games, comic books and novels, it would be their long teeth, made to pierce the neck of their victim and to suck the precious blood out of their veins. Sadly, not true. Today we are well acquainted with the appearance of a vampire to the point that we don't imagine our lovely bloodsuckers without their distinctive fangs. Yet the thought that the vampires should boast an incredible set of teeth has been cemented by Bram Stoker in the novel Dracula. Earlier, between 1845 and 1847, a serialized story, Varney the Vampire, introduced the concept of a vampire with sharp, fang-like teeth. Varney the Vampire is also responsible for a host of other widely recognized tropes, like leaving 2 puncture wounds on the neck of the victim, sneaking through a window to attack a helpless woman, hypnotic powers and tremendous strength of the vampire. The third cornerstone of modern vampire was a short story, The Vampire, from 1819, written by John William Polidori. It introduced an aristocratic, charismatic vampire in the form of Lord Ruthven, based upon Lord Byron himself. But what about the fangs? In 1922 movie Nosferatu Symphony of Horror, Count Orlok was given a set of pointy incisors, but that was a silent movie, which is the most important factor in this matter. The long fangs we know today were too troublesome during stage plays as they hindered speaking. Also, they were too small to be noticed from the back rows, so until the 50s vampires on screen were lacking their famous bite, so to speak. Even the famous Dracula portrayed by Bela Lugosi lacked fangs. It was the Turkish adaptation of Dracula from 1953, Dracula Istanbul'da, that showed vampires with fangs that we know today for the first time. Yet it was the Terence Fisher's Dracula from 1958, with Sir Christopher Lee in the title role, that once and for all established a stereotype of vampire for decades to come. In order to dive into the truth behind the vampires, we need to shed a lot of information so firmly rooted in the pop culture. Vampires we know, aristocratic, charismatic creatures of immense power, creating their own lineages and turning people into children of the night. They never existed. And no, I don't mean an obvious fact that vampires are not real. Of course vampires and other monsters are real. Definitely real. Otherwise we would be just a bunch of frauds trying to scam people for money. However, the monsters we know from fiction are, fictional. Vampires that plagued the people in the bygone centuries weren't super strong, inhumanly fast, or highly sophisticated. In almost every case, there were regular members of the society, mostly peasants or craftsmen living in the villages or cities. Though vampires are now commonly associated with aristocracy, this trope is most likely coming from aforementioned John William Polidori. Let's take a look at a few undead who are mentioned in the historic sources. Let's see. Petar Blagojevich, a peasant. Arnold Paole, a soldier. Sava Savanovich, a miller. Mislata of Blov, shepherd. Old Grit, an elderly woman from the village. Sybilla Mail, a peasant. Marianna Saliga, herbalist and a wife of a former soldier. Revenant of Berwick, a rich townsman. Georg Polza, a peasant. Monk of Melrose, a friar, unsurprisingly, but with a passion for quite secular pleasures, if you know what I mean. Vampire of Anantis Castle, most likely a townsman with a not-so-faithful wife, to quote William of Newburgh, a certain man of evil conduct. Hans Optitz, a shoemaker. And at last, Henry Nodus, a rare example of an undead knight. We are omitting Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Bathory from the list for an obvious reason. They were alive while doing their infamous deeds and thus they cannot be counted as vampires. But we will get to them one day. Most creatures that rose from their graves weren't some kind of eldritch ancient force of evil, but common people. That reminds me. Jeffrey, open up! We need to talk! In almost every case, dealing with the vampire didn't really require some sophisticated equipment. If you are interested in learning more about tools of a monster hunter's trade, watch this video. In some rare instances, destroying a malevolent force demanded some special measures. Jan Neplach, an abbot and chronicler, described the case of exhumation and burning of a woman in Czech village of Levin in 1344. However, the people who dug out the body of the undead were unable to start a fire until they used shingles from the local church. It's a pretty interesting example of combining fire with the belief in holiness of the wood that was used to build the church's roof, but historic sources point out something else. There are almost no historic sources describing a direct face-to-face fight with the vampire, or even other undead like a revenant or a Wiedergänger. Disappointing, I know. An unsuccessful attempt to deal with an undead knight Henry Nodus with a sword, as described by Caesarius of Heisterbach, a successful strangulation of a revenant by an executioner, written down by George Sinclair, and the tale of Asvid and Asmund taken from Icelandic Irbyggja saga, are but a few examples of the scarce evidence that describes a hand-to-hand combat with an undead creature. It is quite anticlimactic, but in most cases, fighting an undead bloodsucker wasn't even a fight at all. People just dug up the body and checked if the deceased person shows any signs that could tell if he or she was a vampire. One of the big tells was slowed or halted decay, which is ironic considering that the same thing under different circumstances was considered a sign of sainthood. Blood at the mouth, unusual position, opened eyes, a thumb laid in opposite hand, funeral shroud sucked into the mouth, shed nails and overgrown hair were all signs of a potential vampire. If discovered, the creature was most likely quartered and burned. Sometimes another method of protection was employed, like coins, stones or stakes. One of the more interesting ways of preventing the dead from rising from the grave, which we didn't mention earlier, was suspending the coffin in the air, like in the case of an exhumed body from Witków or Wittgendorf in 1595. Unlike the werewolves, vampires and the undead weren't confronted face-on. In fact, they rarely attacked in the open, and most vampires didn't even kill their victims with their own hands. In most cases, they were hunting the nearby residents, mutilating the flocks and bringing the disease. In short, they were responsible for every disappearance and unexplained quick death. Let's take a closer look at two vampire cases and explain what truth might be buried here. Hans Opitz, a shoemaker from Strzygom, then Strigoi, killed himself with a knife, which was no small offense in 1591. His wife, afraid of the scandal, hid the cause of death and buried the husband in the cemetery. Afterwards, some people claimed that they saw an apparition that woke them in the middle of the night with shrieks or strangling them in their sleep. Mares, incubus and succubus are now commonly interpreted as a result of sleep paralysis, although Arnulf still waits for his very special succubi.
Come here, you harlots!
Sleep paralysis is often conjoined with hallucinations, feeling of presence of the intruder, and state of hypervigilance. In short, brain goes into panic mode and begins to scan the surrounding in search for any threats, but the asleep body is unable to move, which intensifies the feeling of terror. A common symptom of sleep paralysis is feeling of something heavy pressing on the chest and sensation of being strangled. The latter one is tied to the muscle paralysis and brain struggling with taking control over breathing process. Also, the breathing pattern during REM phase could produce the feeling of suffocation in a case of sudden wake up. All those phenomena are quite common in the stories about vampires. Some victims of Hans Oppit's visits stated that undead left bruises on their bodies. This is also a quite common occurrence, especially for the people who tend to move a lot during their sleep. It must be noted that beds in the past weren't very big, so hitting a wall, frame, or being accidentally hit by your spouse wasn't something out of the ordinary. Also, late Middle Ages saw the introduction of box bed, basically a big cupboard with a bed inside. In a closed, tight space, getting a bruise was pretty easy. Another factor is the speed at which bruises appear and, well, consumption of alcohol. Alcohol thins the blood, which can make bruising easier. Thus, people could ascribe unusual marks on their body with the presence of a vampire. Finally, Hans Oppitz was seen in the flesh during the night, when he was beating passers-by, sometimes leaving them unconscious with sources stating that somebody died because of those attacks. Vampire attacking people like a common thug? Well, explanation could be quite simple. Probably it was just a ruffian or a thief who was attacking people near cemetery at night. The frequency of those occurrences intensified, and after some time the deceased appeared not only at night, but even in the light of day, at noon, and the violence of the apparition's actions was so frightening that people dared not spend any time in the dark. Especially at night when searching for the light, scared to take a look when in the corner of the room they sense that something is watching you. A fear of the dark, you might say. Stop making noises! The second case concerns Arnold Paole, an arch-vampire himself. Arch-vampire. That sounds important, but in fact Arnold was a hajduk, a common soldier, border guard, or a robber, whatever floats your boat. Paole moved to Medveda, a village on the border between Austria and Ottomans, but he carried with him something more than a rifle. Arnold boasted that he already dealt with a vampire, or more precisely, a vampire. The undead was haunting Paole, but he ate some ground from the vampire's grave and smeared himself with the blood of the creature, thus freeing himself from the evil spell. Around 1725, Paole fell from the hay wagon and broke his neck, which sent him to the grave. But true evil cannot be killed in an accident during fieldwork. After the death of Paole, a few people stated that Arnold was haunting them and died shortly thereafter from an unknown illness. The villagers acted quickly and opened Arnold's grave, and what they found chilled them to the bone. Paole's body wasn't decomposing. Fresh blood flowed from his mouth, eyes, nose, and ears, staining the shirt. His hair, beard, and nails grew. Clear signs of an arch-vampire that was feeding on the living by spreading illness. The stake was driven through Paole's chest, his head cut from the body, and then the corpse was reduced to ashes in the fire along with the bodies of his victims. The vampire was stopped. For now. A couple years later, the mysterious pestilence returned, and it was traced to Milica, a woman who ate meat from the sheep killed by Paole or one of his victims. Another suspect was Stana, a young woman who admitted that she smeared herself with vampire's blood when she was living on the Ottoman side of the border, where undead roamed freely. During the winter of 1731, Milica, Stana, and over a dozen of villagers suffered from fever and pains and died in quick succession. The official investigation from January of 1732 stated that 12 bodies were in vampiric condition. They were staked, decapitated, burned, and the remaining ashes were thrown into the river. This time the undead were vanquished for good. There is a lot to unpack with this particular story. First of all, contact with blood of the vampire was considered a way to gain protection from the undead, but it was a risky move. Both Paole and Stana did so and were later considered vampires. Probably here lies the origin of the stories about vampires creating their own bloodlines, which were later connected with more aristocratic notions about noble families and houses. Of course, it must be stated that blood from times immemorial was considered to be an extremely powerful factor during many rituals involving oaths and swearing of fealty. Not to mention that bonds of blood are what ties families together. A second interesting thing that we can uncover from the story of Arnulf Paole is the fact that he wasn't attacking people directly. He was lying in his grave while inflicting harm and spreading disease among the villagers of Medwieda. The notion that a vampire was hidden in his or her grave isn't uncommon in Europe. In fact, a German Nachtzerer is haunting in the same manner, by patiently sucking life force from surrounding people. So, why did the vampires not leave their comfy graves and suck the fresh blood from afar, instead of giving the sexy neck bites? Well, because they didn't have to. Vampires were plague incarnated, an embodiment of sickness that could decimate the living without raising a hand. Not to mention rising from the grave. Cheers! Black Death and other rapidly progressing diseases were the prime reason for existence of the vampires. People in the past didn't exactly know how plagues were transmitted, and due to an incubation period, many illnesses could strike the whole village at the same time, seemingly at the behest of some dark forces. Without modern medicine, plague was able to decimate population of every village, town or city within weeks, leaving behind only severed threads of human life. Finally, we need to address the way the vampires were identified. The second outbreak of vampiric infestation, connected to Arnulf Paole, took place in winter, and exhumations of bodies under the supervision of local authorities was conducted in January. It is no coincidence that so many bodies didn't decompose. Tightly wrapping the body in funeral shroud, digging deep into the ground, low temperature, lack of oxygen, certain type of soil and no insects present all contribute to slowing the process of decomposing. It is no surprise that well-secured body would show little sign of decay, especially in the eyes of people who didn't know about chemical machinations that begin after death. When the body of Arnulf Paole was pierced with a stake, the vampire supposedly let out a terrifying shriek. Now we can tell that it was most likely gases that amassed inside the body during decomposition. The presence of a significant amount of blood oozing from eyes, mouth and nose is also tied to the decay of internal organs. Many symptoms attributed to the vampires are nowadays easy to explain thanks to the better understanding of human body. And that brings us to the name of the greatest vampire slayer in history. His name is... No, not that one, not Van Helsing either. Gerard von Swieten. Gerard van Swieten was a Dutch physician who completely changed the way people in Austrian monarchy were treated and taught about medicine. But what is more important, his study called Abhandlung des Desiens der Gespenster, or Discourse on the Existence of Ghosts, offered a scientific explanation to the phenomena behind the belief in vampires. His work convinced Queen Maria Theresa to ban all practices involving beheading, burning and piercing corpses with a stake. He also stopped the witch trials in Croatia by saving Magda Logoma, a herbalist from Križevci. In a way, Gerard van Swieten was the most successful and, I dare say, only true vampire slayer. Apart from us, of course. But there are some sources that tell us about vampire walking in broad daylight, like a Bohemian shepherd, Myslata of Blov. Apart from hysteria, is there any more tangible explanation behind dead that could walk again? Medical conditions that lead to necrotizing skin or leprosy could be interpreted by people as a proof of living dead, though people in Middle Ages and subsequent centuries were overall quite familiar with lepers and even built special colonies where they were isolated. Not the most pleasant place to stay, but in the terms of potential explanation for vampires, leprosy won't do. Another explanation of the undead phenomenon could be people being mistakenly presumed dead. Wounded or sick could fall into a coma and be thrown into a grave or prepared for a funeral. Such stories could explain appearance of non-aggressive revenants and undead. William of Newburgh recorded peculiar case from Buckingham County. Freshly deceased man was returning at night to the bed of his wife, almost crushing her to death with the weight of his body. When he was chased away, a revenant started visiting his brothers. The undead was stopped by a letter of absolution from Bishop of Lincoln that was placed upon the grave. But was the body actually inside? Or did the man just leave town? We may never know. But is there something more? Certainly. Tuberculosis is a good lead that ties nicely with the vampires. An invisible force that can kill half of the infected people matches the vampire modus operandi quite well. Transmittable bacteria and viruses have a strong correlation with vampires, who most likely were used as an explanation of sudden surges of dead bodies in the neighborhood. Another suspect is porphyria, a congenital blood disease that is often connected with vampires. Porphyria, among other symptoms, causes receding of gums, mental problems, hallucinations, discoloration of the teeth and nails, and makes the skin sensitive to sunlight, which results in painful blisters. There was a theory that people suffering from porphyria were drinking blood to replenish iron in their bodies. However, people with this disorder do not crave hematin, an enzyme within blood that would help to battle the symptoms of porphyria. Also, hematin is not absorbed by ingestion. Also, porphyria is a very rare genetic disorder which does not mesh with the widespread belief in vampires. Clinical vampirism, known also under the name of Renfield's syndrome, is also used to explain the presence of the vampires, but like aforementioned porphyria, those two names fit very well with the modern vampire and not with the vampire from folklore and olden tales. In this case, the familiar knowledge about vampires influenced the perception of the sickness and not the other way around. Rabies is the last name on our list. Here we have a strong contender for true vampiric illness. Rabies is a fatal virus disease that can be transmitted to a human from a rabid animal via scratching or biting. Since some beliefs draw a very thin line between a vampire and a werewolf, that explanation is already quite fascinating. Just like vampires are predominantly male, rabies is 7 times more common in men than in women. This illness attacks the nervous system, which results in erratic behavior including biting, insomnia, sexual arousal, frothing, bleeding from the mouth, and facial muscle spasms that results in showing teeth. People affected by rabies are showing aversion to strong factors like sunlight, water, and smell. And garlic is famous for its unmistakable odor. Lastly, rabies spreads through biting, which nicely ties into the vampiric lore. However, many of those things might be coincidental. Turning people into vampires by biting is quite a fresh addition to the vampire mythos, just like aversion to sunlight and connecting vampires with unsatiated carnal lust. As we mentioned in the previous videos, garlic and flowing water are tied to beliefs that aren't explicitly connected to rabies, but it is hard to dismiss all similarities between said illness and vampires. In the end, there is another monster that fits much better into the symptoms of rabies. But this is a story for another time. For now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Arnulf, get the shovel, we're hunting werewolves.